The train brakes screamed against cold steel somewhere west of Fort Worth, and through the cattle car slats, Elsa Kirchner caught her first glimpse of America, not the flattened cities she'd been told to expect, but an endless ocean of winter grass rolling toward a horizon so wide it made her chest tighten. The January wind carried smells she couldn't name: creosote, livestock, something sweet like burned sugar. Beside her, 43 other women pressed faces to the gaps, silent now after 2 days of speculation. They'd surrendered in North Africa, been processed through Casablanca, shipped across an Atlantic thick with wolf packs, then railroaded inland for 76 hours without explanation. The propaganda back in Hamburg had promised them industrial wastelands and revenge. What waited beyond those slats would rewrite everything they thought they understood about enemies, machinery, and the machinery of war itself. The railhead at Hebronville squatted low and sun-bleached under a January sky, so blue it felt like a physical presence. Elsa had spent 3 years maintaining Junker's hydraulic systems in Tunis, had learned to read pressure by touch and diagnose valve failure by sound alone, but nothing in her technical training prepared her for the architecture of Texas logistics. The platform stretched 200 yards, lined with pallets of barbed wire, lumber, canvas, medical crates stenciled with red crosses. No guards pointed rifles. Instead, 3 men in wide-brimmed hats and dusty boots stood beside a flatbed truck, one coiling rope with the casual precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. When the railcar doors finally rolled open, sunlight poured in like a flood, and the women blinked against it, expecting shouts or shackles. What they got was a clipboard, and a canteen of cold water passed hand to hand without comment. The processing took 90 minutes. Names recorded in triplicate, photographs taken against a whitewashed wall, medical checks conducted by a woman in an Army Nurse Corps uniform who spoke no German, but communicated everything through gestures, so efficient they felt like a second language. Elsa noticed small things: the way the clipboard moved from station to station on a wheeled cart, the electric fan humming in the corner despite January's chill, the coffee pot on a hot plate beside a stack of tin cups. No one rushed them. No one spoke with the clipped contempt she'd braced for. When her turn came for the photograph, the technician adjusted the light with the same methodical care she'd once given to torque specifications, and she found herself standing straighter, meeting the lens with something that wasn't quite defiance but wasn't surrender either. The camp itself materialized like a mirage through waves of heat shimmer, though the temperature barely touched 50 degrees. Rows of whitewashed barracks stretched in geometric precision, each building identical to the next, separated by gravel paths wide enough for trucks. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the men inside seemed more interested in paperwork than surveillance. Elsa counted details the way she'd once counted rivets: 12 barracks, one mess hall with screened windows, a recreation building with a basketball hoop bolted to the exterior wall, a row of latrines with proper plumbing. Behind everything, a water tower rose like a steel lighthouse, its shadow sweeping across the compound as the sun tracked west. The fence was there, chain-link topped with wire, but it felt almost decorative compared to the vastness beyond it, as if the real barrier was just the sheer implausibility of escape into that empty golden distance. They learned the rules that first evening, standing in formation outside the mess hall while a captain named Morrison read from a printed sheet in careful, phonetically coached German. Geneva Convention standards would be observed. They would work, but only in non-military capacities: agricultural support, mess hall duties, laundry, maintenance of their own facilities. Wages would accrue in camp scrip, redeemable at a canteen that sold cigarettes, chocolate, toiletries, and writing paper. Letters home were permitted, one per month, subject to censorship. Religious services available on request. Any violation of camp regulations would result in disciplinary confinement, but no physical punishment. Medical care equivalent to that provided to American servicewomen. Questions could be directed to the camp liaison, a German-speaking sergeant who would visit barracks twice weekly. Then Morrison folded the paper, nodded once, and walked away, his boots crunching gravel in a rhythm that felt almost companionable. The first meal arrived at 1800 hours, served cafeteria-style on compartmented metal trays. Elsa had expected thin soup and black bread, the wartime rations that had defined her last 2 years. What appeared instead made several women stop mid-line, starring pot roast with carrots and potatoes, green beans glistening with butter, a square of cornbread wrapped in wax paper, canned peaches in syrup, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd choked down in Tunis. She carried her tray to a long table, sat beside a woman named Greta who'd worked in radio interception, and ate slowly, tasting each component as if it might be a hallucination. The pot roast was oversalted but tender. The cornbread had a sweetness that reminded her of cake. The coffee was weak but hot and genuine. Around her, 43 other women ate in silence, processing this first data point in a recalculation of everything they'd believed about American industrial capacity and priorities. The contradiction sharpened over the following days. They'd been told America was stretched thin, rationing butter and sugar, cannibalizing cars for metal. Yet every morning, trucks delivered fresh milk in glass bottles, eggs by the crate, flour in 100-pound sacks. The mess hall's electrical refrigerators hummed 24 hours, keeping meat cold in a way that would have been impossible in Hamburg even before the war. Elsa volunteered for kitchen duty, partly to stay occupied, partly to understand the system. She watched how cooks worked: gas ranges with 6 burners each, hot water on demand, industrial mixers that could handle 20 pounds of dough at once. No one hoarded. No one carefully portioned to make supplies last. The abundance felt almost obscene, not because it was luxurious, the food was plain, but because it was casual. The waste bins filled with chicken bones, vegetable trimmings, uneaten bread. Back home, those scraps would have fed 3 families. On the 5th day, they were assigned work details. Elsa's mechanical background earned her a spot in the motor pool, maintaining trucks that ferried supplies between Hebronville and the surrounding ranches. Her supervisor was a staff sergeant named Alvarez who'd grown up fixing tractors in the Rio Grande Valley and spoke Spanish, English, and enough German to explain what needed doing. He handed her a toolbox, pointed at a GMC 2.5-ton with a leaking oil pan, and told her to make it stop leaking. No test, no supervision, just an assumption of competence that felt more radical than any propaganda she'd ever encountered. She crawled under the truck, identified a cracked gasket, replaced it with a part from the organized bins lining the shop wall, torqued the bolts to specification, and wiped her hands on a rag that smelled like diesel and Texas dust. Alvarez checked her work, nodded, and assigned her 3 more trucks. By the end of the week, she'd become indispensable. The motor pool became her lens into the mechanical heart of American logistics. Every morning, trucks rolled out loaded with fence posts, cattle feed, irrigation equipment, seed. They returned empty and rolled out again, an endless circulation of material that never seemed to deplete. Elsa maintained 19 vehicles in rotation, learning their quirks the way she'd once learned Junker's hydraulics. This one burned oil, that one had a temperamental starter, another pulled left because its frame had been bent in a ditch and straightened just enough to function. The parts never ran out. When she needed a water pump, Alvarez pulled one from a shelf stocked with 6 identical units. When a tire blew, he had her mount a replacement from a stack of 2 dozen. The scale made her dizzy. She tried explaining it to Greta one night, lying on her bunk in the dark. They don't ration, they don't improvise, they just order more. Winter yielded to early spring, and the landscape transformed from gold to green almost overnight. The camp routine settled into a rhythm that felt less like imprisonment than a strange, suspended peacetime. They worked 6 days, rested 1. The canteen sold magazines, candy bars, shampoo, and actual ice cream, hand-cranked in a wooden churn by 2 prisoners who'd been dairy workers before the war. On Sundays, A Lutheran minister drove out from Corpus Christi to hold services in the recreation hall. And afterward, women sat in the sun writing letters home on Red Cross stationery, their words carefully neutral to pass the censors. Elsa wrote to her mother every month, describing the weather, the food, the work, never quite able to convey the cognitive dissonance of fixing American trucks under a sky so vast it made Germany feel claustrophobic by comparison. The first cowboys arrived in April riding horses that looked like they'd stepped from a Western film. They were ranchers from the surrounding spreads, contracted to teach basic ranch work to prisoners willing to labor on agricultural details. Elsa watched from the motor pool as a man named Bill Thornton, 60 years old, leather-skinned, moving with the economy of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, walked through the compound trailing a dozen quarter horses on lead ropes. The horses' hooves thudded soft against caliche dirt, their breath steaming in the morning cool. Thornton didn't speak German, but he didn't need to. He demonstrated haltering, led each woman who'd volunteered through the motion of mounting, adjusted stirrups with gnarled hands that knew horseflesh the way Elsa knew gaskets. Then he pointed at the horizon and clicked his tongue, and they rode. Greta was among the riders. She returned that first evening wind-burned and grinning, smelling of sweat and horsehair, talking faster than Elsa had heard her speak in months. "You can't understand until you feel it," she said, collapsing onto her bunk. "The horse knows what you're thinking. You shift your weight, it turns. You squeeze, it accelerates. It's like flying but connected to the ground." She described riding fence lines, checking water troughs, moving cattle from one pasture to another, work that would have taken hours on foot compressed into fluid motion. The cowboys didn't shout or micromanage. They showed once, then expected competence, correcting only when necessary and always with the same patient economy. By the second week, Greta could rope a post at 15 feet. By the third, she was riding alone to check far pastures, trusted with a horse and a job and nothing but empty country between her and Mexico. The shock wasn't the freedom, it was the trust. Elsa turned this over during long nights when heat made sleep difficult and her mind spun through implications. Back home, the propaganda had painted Americans as soft, decadent, industrially powerful but morally weak. Yet here, in this place where physical escape was logistically absurd but symbolically possible, the guards maintained order through assumption rather than coercion. They believed you'd work honestly because work needed doing. They believed you'd return from fence line duty because where else would you go? The barbed wire remained, the roll calls continued, but underneath ran a current of presumed decency that felt more binding than chains. It was a psychological engineering as precise as anything she'd learned in technical school, control through integration rather than suppression. The heat arrived in May like a declaration of war. Temperatures climbed past 90 by mid-morning, past 100 by afternoon, settling into a thick, breathless blanket that made every movement deliberate. The barracks trapped heat like ovens despite open windows and cross breeze. Women learned to move slowly, work in early morning or late evening, spend midday hours in whatever shade they could find. The motor pool became unbearable, steel surfaces hot enough to blister skin, the air above the trucks shimmering with heat ghosts. Alvarez adjusted the schedule without being asked, starting work at 5 in the morning when stars still hung in the western sky, breaking at 10, resuming at 4 when the sun's angle shifted. Elsa found herself appreciating his pragmatism, the way he treated heat as a technical problem requiring procedural solutions rather than something to be endured through sheer will. The ice cream churn ran continuously now, turned by prisoners in 2-hour shifts. Someone discovered that the canteen sold root beer extract, and a woman named Ilse who'd worked in a Munich apothecary figured out how to make root beer floats using the ice cream and carbonated water from the mess hall. The recipe spread through the compound like wildfire, and suddenly Sunday afternoon centered on a bizarre ritual. German prisoners of war, 8,000 miles from home, sitting in the Texas heat drinking root beer floats and arguing about proper proportions of ice cream to soda. Elsa participated because refusing felt churlish, but the absurdity never quite left her. This was war. This suspended state of labor and relative comfort and cold carbonation on a hot afternoon. In June, Thornton brought a problem to the motor pool. One of his irrigation pumps had failed, a gasoline engine driving a centrifugal pump that lifted water from an underground aquifer to surface tanks. He tried fixing it himself but lacked the specialized tools. Alvarez sent Elsa with a truck full of equipment, and she spent a morning in a pasture 12 miles from camp, surrounded by cattle and mesquite, diagnosing a scored cylinder that needed boring and re-sleeving. The work took 6 hours. Thornton brought her lunch, sandwiches, and lemonade in a thermos, then sat in his truck's shade reading a livestock journal while she worked. He didn't supervise, didn't question her competence, just let her work, occasionally glancing over with the mild interest of someone watching a professional do professional things. When she finally got the engine running, he nodded, paid her the compliment of no excessive praise, and drove her back to camp in companionable silence broken only by observations about the weather. The incident recurred. Ranchers learned the camp held a mechanic who understood engines, and requests started flowing through official channels. Elsa found herself spending 2-3 days a week in the field, maintaining generators, fixing tractors, troubleshooting balky irrigation systems. The work satisfied something she hadn't realized was starving: the problem-solving flow state of diagnosis and repair, the tactile pleasure of metal responding to proper torque, the satisfaction of hearing an engine cough to life after hours of careful adjustment. She began carrying a notebook, sketching mechanical problems and solutions, noting which American designs were clever and which were over-engineered. The notebook became a document of professional respect, a catalog of encounters with machinery that worked differently than German equipment, but worked nonetheless, often with a robustness that prioritized field repairability over elegant design. July brought news from Europe, filtered through newspapers the camp received 3 days late. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Italian resistance was crumbling. The Eastern Front was bleeding Germany white in a war of attrition that made the North African campaign look like a skirmish. Elsa read the articles in the recreation hall, cross-referencing them with what she remembered from before capture, trying to construct a coherent picture from censored fragments. The other women reacted variously. Some clung to belief in ultimate German victory, citing secret weapons and strategic withdrawals. Others sank into quiet depression. A few began the psychological work of accepting that the world they'd left no longer existed and might never return. Elsa found herself in a fourth category: suspended judgment, waiting for more data, unwilling to commit to hope or despair until the pattern became undeniable. The mail arrived irregularly, letters from home delayed by months, censored into near incoherence, sometimes arriving in batches that jumbled chronology into confusion. Elsa's mother wrote in careful code, describing who was traveling, bombed out, and who had taken new employment, conscripted or arrested. Between the lines, a portrait emerged of a Hamburg slowly collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing, rationing, and conscription. Her mother's handwriting remained steady, but the paper quality declined, first to cheap pulp, then to what looked like repurposed packaging. The contrast with her own circumstances created a guilt that sat in her chest like undigested food. She was eating pot roast and fixing trucks while her mother survived on turnips and hoped the sirens wouldn't sound tonight. The unfairness of it made her angry in ways she couldn't articulate, even in the privacy of her bunk after lights out. August brought a new arrival: 23 more German POWs, these captured in Sicily, shell-shocked and underfed in ways that made the Texas contingent look healthy by comparison. They'd been processed through the same pipeline, Casablanca, Atlantic crossing, rail journey, but their eyes held a different quality, a blankness that came from watching something fundamental break. Elsa helped integrate them, showing them the ropes, translating camp procedures, demonstrating that the rules here operated on principles they'd need to relearn. One woman, Katrin, had been a secretary in a Luftwaffe headquarters. She kept asking when they'd be punished, when the beatings would start, when food would be withheld as discipline. The questions revealed what normal had become in the shrinking perimeter of Axis control. The work details expanded. With more prisoners available, the camp commander, a Colonel Hartwell who ran the facility with the efficient detachment of someone managing a medium-security boarding school, negotiated contracts with additional ranches. Women spread across South Texas, working cattle, picking cotton, maintaining fences, operating equipment. A few discovered talents they hadn't known they possessed. Ilse turned out to be a gifted gardener, coaxing tomatoes and peppers from the camp's victory garden with the same precision she'd once applied to pharmaceutical chemistry. Katrin, recovered from her initial shock, became the camp's unofficial accountant, managing the canteen's books with meticulous accuracy. The camp stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a company town, complete with internal economy, social hierarchies, and the grinding dailiness of routine that defined most of human existence. Elsa's reputation as a mechanic spread beyond the immediate ranching community. In September, a cotton gin 30 miles south of Hebronville had a conveyor system fail during harvest. The civilian mechanic who normally maintained it had been drafted. His replacement was incompetent, and 2,000 acres of cotton were coming ripe with nowhere to process it. The gin owner, a man named Hoskins who'd inherited the operation from his father, swallowed his pride and called the camp. Alvarez sent Elsa with a toolkit and a military escort. A bored MP named Chen who spent the day reading westerns in the truck cab while she crawled through the gin's mechanical guts, tracing a jam in the feed system back to a bent roller that needed heating, hammering, and precise realignment. The work took 14 hours across 2 days. Hoskins paid the camp the going rate for skilled labor, shook Elsa's hand with the careful formality of someone navigating unfamiliar social territory, and told Alvarez to send her back if anything else broke. The gesture, that handshake, occupied her thoughts for days. It was transactional, professional, devoid of warmth but also devoid of hostility. She was useful. That utility had translated into a form of respect that transcended their positions as captor and captive. Back home, she'd been told Americans respected only power, understood only force. Yet here was Hoskins, treating her as he might treat any skilled tradesperson, compensating her work through proper channels, acknowledging competence without theatrical gratitude or patronizing surprise. The interaction felt more subversive than any propaganda, because it suggested that the architecture of respect could function independently of national loyalty, that professional competency created its own currency in systems that valued function over ideology. Autumn arrived not with falling leaves. South Texas had few deciduous trees, but with a subtle softening of the heat, a shift in the light's angle that made mornings almost cool and evenings pleasant. The camp garden exploded with late-season vegetables, squash, peppers, tomatillos, beans. Women who'd never cooked anything more complex than boiled potatoes learned to make chili, cornbread, biscuits, experimenting with ingredients and techniques borrowed from the mess hall staff. A friendly competition emerged. Which barracks could produce the best Sunday dinner using only canteen ingredients and garden produce? The contests were judged by Sergeant Morrison and Alvarez, who approached the task with solemn seriousness, scoring on taste, presentation, and creativity. The winners received extra canteen privileges. The losers vowed revenge and spent the week plotting culinary improvements. The normalization was intentional, Elsa realized. Every aspect of camp life seemed designed to maintain routines that approximated civilian existence: work, rest, leisure, small competitions, minor luxuries earned through effort. The psychological effect was to drain away the acute consciousness of captivity, replacing it with the duller but more sustainable mindset of people living in a company town with restricted movement but relative security. It was brilliant, in its way. Angry prisoners caused problems. Busy, relatively comfortable prisoners just wanted to get through their shifts, and enjoy their root beer floats in peace. The strategy worked because it aligned incentives. The camp administration needed productivity and order. The prisoners needed purpose and predictability. The overlap created a strange equilibrium that benefited everyone except, perhaps, the abstract concept of ideological purity. October brought the first storm system of autumn, a low-pressure cell that roared up from the Gulf, turning the sky green and unleashing rain that fell not in drops but in vertical sheets, hammering the tin roofs with a sound like sustained artillery. The camp flooded in the low spots, drainage ditches overflowing, turning the gravel paths to red mud that clung to boots and sucked at wheels. Work details were canceled. Women huddled in barracks, playing cards, reading, writing letters, listening to the weather rage outside with a violence that felt almost comforting in its indifference to human concerns. Elsa sat by a window, watching rain pummel the motor pool's tin roof, and thought about Hamburg, about the firestorms, about whether the rain ever fell there anymore, or if the city had burned so thoroughly that it had altered the local climate. The storm passed after 3 days, leaving behind air so clean and cool it felt like a gift. The landscape transformed, green erupting from seemingly dead soil, wildflowers appearing overnight in explosions of blue and yellow and red. The ranchers moved cattle to take advantage of new grass. Work details resumed with renewed energy, everyone grateful to be outside after 3 days of confinement. Elsa repaired trucks whose engines had sucked water through air intakes, replacing filters, draining crankcases, coaxing them back to life with the patient methodology that defined her approach to all mechanical problems. Alvarez watched her work one morning, then said in his deliberate German, "You're too good for this. After the war, you should come back. Americans need mechanics. You could run your own shop." She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded and returned to her work. But the comment lodged in her mind like a seed. November arrived with news of the Tehran Conference. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin meeting to coordinate strategy, carving up the post-war world in ways that made Germany's defeat feel not just possible but inevitable. The newspapers reached camp 4 days late, but their impact rippled through the barracks in quiet conversations, recalculations of futures that had seemed uncertain but now hardened into probability. Some women became more withdrawn, mourning the country they'd served. Others grew almost relieved, as if the certainty of outcome lifted a burden of ambiguous loyalty. Elsa found herself in neither camp, instead thinking practically. What skills transferred to peace? What training would matter when the shooting stopped? How to position herself for whatever came next? The camp commander instituted an education program. English classes taught by volunteers from Hebronville, vocational training in typing and bookkeeping, even a lending library stocked with donated books in German and English. The obvious goal was to prepare them for repatriation and reintegration, to ensure they returned home with skills that could rebuild a shattered economy. Elsa signed up for English, discovering she had an aptitude for languages when they were taught through practical application rather than abstract grammar. She learned mechanical terminology first: cylinder, gasket, torque, clearance. Then expanded outward, practicing with Alvarez during work hours, with Chen during long truck rides, building a vocabulary that felt like armor against an uncertain future. December brought cold that felt personal after months of heat. Temperatures dropped into the 30s at night, and the barracks' thin walls provided little insulation. The camp issued blankets, heavy wool scratchy against skin, and the mess hall started serving soup at every meal. Women adapted, layering clothes, spending evenings in the recreation hall where a potbelly stove turned the air thick and drowsy, writing letters home that described Texas winter with a specificity that conveyed both strangeness and a kind of grudging affection. Elsa wrote to her mother about armadillos and mesquite, about skis so clear you could see satellites or high-altitude bombers depending on the hour, about the way morning frost turned spiderwebs into crystal geometry. She didn't mention the guilt, the confusion, the growing suspicion that she understood her captors better than she understood her own country's motivations. Christmas arrived with an elaborate mess hall dinner: turkey, dressing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, 3 kinds of pie. The Lutheran minister held a midnight service, and women who hadn't sung hymns in years found themselves harmonizing in 4-part arrangements, their voices filling the recreation hall with a beauty that felt almost painful in its sincerity. Someone had fashioned a Christmas tree from a mesquite branch, decorating it with paper ornaments folded from magazine pages. The effect was ridiculous and tender and heartbreaking all at once. Elsa attended out of obligation, but found herself moved despite her skepticism, caught by the cognitive dissonance of celebrating a German holiday in an American prison with women who'd been enemies, and were now just people marking time in a strange land, trying to remember who they'd been before the world caught fire. The new year arrived with little fanfare. 1944 became 1945, and with it came news that made the camp's routines feel increasingly surreal. The Allies breaching the Siegfried Line, Soviet forces driving toward Berlin, German cities reduced to rubble under round-the-clock bombing. The newspapers stopped arriving regularly, whether due to censorship or simply because the camp administration decided the news was too demoralizing. Elsa couldn't tell. Rumors filled the vacuum. Hitler was dead. Hitler was alive and planning a counteroffensive. The war would end by spring. The war would drag on for years. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone, manifesting in shorter tempers, more arguments over trivial matters, a general sense that they were all waiting for a verdict that would determine whether their lives could restart or had ended years ago without anyone noticing. Work continued because work had to continue. Ranchers needed trucks maintained, cotton gins needed repair, irrigation systems required troubleshooting. Elsa spent a week in February fixing a diesel generator that powered a remote pumping station, camping on site with Chen as her escort, eating canned rations, sleeping in the truck, working through problems by lantern light. The generator was ancient, built in the 20s, held together through improvisation and stubborn refusal to die. She fabricated parts from scrap metal, ground valves by hand, adjusted timing by ear. When it finally fired, settling into a rough idle that smoothed as everything found its thermal equilibrium, she felt a satisfaction disproportionate to the task's modest scale. Something broken had been fixed. In a world defined by destruction, that felt like subversion. March brought warmth and word that the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Rhine had been crossed. Germany was being invaded from both directions. The infrastructure that had sustained the Wehrmacht was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and Soviet advance. The news reached camp through official channels now, posted on a bulletin board outside the administration building, stripped of editorial comment, but damning in its factual recitation of shrinking perimeters and captured cities. Women gathered to read the updates, silent, processing information that confirmed what they'd suspected but hoped might somehow reverse. Elsa read the names of cities she'd visited, routes she'd traveled, places that had seemed permanent and were now described in past tense. The camp administration prepared for repatriation, though no one knew when it would happen or what conditions would greet them. Women were encouraged to write comprehensive letters home, establishing contact with relatives, confirming addresses, creating paper trails that would help them reconnect after years of separation. Elsa wrote to her mother with more honesty than the censors had previously allowed, describing her work, her complicated gratitude for decent treatment, her fear about returning to a country that might not exist in any recognizable form. She asked practical questions. Was the house still standing? Were her tools still in the basement workshop? Had the neighborhood survived? She mailed the letter knowing it might reach Hamburg before she did, carried by systems that continued functioning even as the war that had created them collapsed. April brought German surrender rumors, denied, then confirmed, then denied again. The fog of information warfare made it impossible to know what was true until May 8th, when Colonel Hartwell assembled the entire camp in the recreation yard and read a brief statement. Germany had unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Repatriation procedures would begin immediately but would take months to execute. Until then, all current arrangements would remain in effect. Questions could be directed to barracks leaders. Then he folded his paper and walked away, leaving 400 women standing in formation, absorbing news that should have felt momentous, but instead felt anticlimactic, the predicted conclusion to a mathematical proof they'd been working through for months. The aftermath was numbness. No one celebrated. No one wept. They dispersed to barracks to work details, to the routines that had sustained them through captivity, moving through tasks with the automaticity of people who'd learned to suspend emotional processing until they had time and privacy to feel without audience. Elsa returned to the motor pool, replaced a starter motor on a GMC, adjusted valve clearances on a Ford, greased chassis fittings with methodical attention to specified intervals. The work was familiar, requiring just enough concentration to prevent thought, and she lost herself in it gratefully, grateful for the temporary escape from the obligation to react. The weeks following surrender brought a gradual acceleration of activity. Red Cross representatives arrived to document prisoners, confirm identities, assess medical needs, establish repatriation priority. Women with families in intact cities went first, then those with specific skills needed for reconstruction, then everyone else in bureaucratic order determined by algorithms invisible to those affected. Elsa's repatriation date was set for August, 3 months away, contingent on shipping availability and receiving facility capacity. The delay was frustrating but also a relief. 3 more months of known routines, predictable work, relative safety before facing whatever Hamburg had become. The camp population shrank gradually through June and July. Women departed in groups of 20 to 30, trucked to railheads, disappeared into the vast machinery of demobilization. Each departure felt like a small death, a severance of connections that had been forced but had become genuine. Greta left in late June, heading back to a family she hadn't seen in 4 years, promising to write but both of them knowing that was unlikely. The barracks emptied, then were refilled with new arrivals. Women captured later, processed through different channels, bringing stories of final desperate battles and collapse. Elsa avoided them, unwilling to integrate new people when she'd soon be departing herself, preferring the company of her work and the few remaining members of the original Texas contingent. Her final work assignment came in mid-July, a week-long project repairing irrigation pumps across 3 connected ranches. Alvarez assigned her a truck, tools, and Chen as escort, then shook her hand formally and told her to do good work. She spent 7 days driving between properties, diagnosing problems, fabricating solutions, working with a freedom that felt almost civilian. The ranchers knew she was leaving and each expressed gratitude in their taciturn way, a thermos of cold lemonade, a handshake, a gruff acknowledgement that things ran better when she'd fixed them. On the final day, Thornton gave her a small wooden box he'd made himself, lined with felt, containing a complete set of precision screwdrivers. "Every mechanic needs good tools," he said. "These are yours." She tried to refuse. Accepting gifts from enemy civilians felt like a bridge too far, but he insisted with the same quiet stubbornness he brought to everything. She took the box, thanked him in her careful English, and drove back to camp with the certainty that she'd never understand what had happened here, never fully process the contradiction of being treated with more professional respect as a prisoner than she'd experienced as a free technical worker in Germany. August arrived hot and final. Her departure date came, the 16th, a Thursday 0600 departure from the camp. She packed her few possessions, distributed her excess to women remaining behind, said awkward goodbyes to people she'd lived beside for 18 months. Alvarez gave her a letter of recommendation, typed on official letterhead, describing her mechanical competence in language that would translate across borders and bureaucratic systems. Colonel Hartwell signed her discharge papers with the same efficient disinterest he'd shown at arrival, wishing her luck with the tone of someone closing a completed file. Chen drove her to the railhead, helped load her into a car filled with other repatriates, then stepped back and saluted, an odd gesture given their relative positions, but one that felt appropriate somehow. The train pulled away at dawn, and through the window Elsa watched Texas slide past in reverse, scrubland giving way to slightly less scrubland, the horizon endless and indifferent, the sky already bleaching toward afternoon blue. She thought about the first time she'd seen this landscape, pressing her face to cattle car slats, expecting industrial wasteland and revenge. What she'd found instead was harder to process. A system so wealthy it could afford generosity, so confident it could risk trust, so vast that individual instances of kindness or cruelty barely registered against the scale of its operations. She'd learned more about American industrial capacity from maintaining 19 trucks than from any intelligence briefing. She'd understood more about democratic philosophy from being handed a clipboard and expected to function than from all the propaganda she'd been fed about weakness and decadence. The crossing back to Europe took 3 weeks, Atlantic passage on a converted Liberty ship, processing through British facilities, rail transport through France, then the slow, bureaucratized handoff to German civilian authorities who were themselves supervised by occupying forces. She traveled with her wooden box of screwdrivers, her letter of recommendation, her notebook full of mechanical sketches, and a complex set of memories she couldn't yet articulate. The landscape of Europe shocked her, not just the destruction which she'd expected, but the totality of it, the way entire cities had been reduced to geometric rubble, the way survivors moved through ruins with the blank efficiency of people beyond trauma. Hamburg was worse than she'd imagined. The house was gone, reduced to a foundation, and a chimney standing like a headstone. Her mother had survived by evacuating to the countryside, living with relatives, returning only when the occupation made it safe. They reunited at a displaced persons center, a building that had been a school, then a military headquarters, now a processing facility for people trying to reconstruct identity from ash. Her mother had aged a decade in 4 years, her hair entirely white, her hands trembling with a palsy that suggested months of